Hey, good morning. I hope your track meet went well today, or if you were sick today, I hope you're starting to feel better. But today what we want to do, guys, is we want to look at the troubles behind the scenes of the Iron Curtain. Did we know these things were going on during the Cold War? We sure did. But the Soviet Union tried its best that we wouldn't know what was happening. That's what the cartoon illustrates here. If you look closely at that cartoon, look what we're seeing here. We're seeing people trying to get through or under the Iron Curtain, and then you have a gentleman above the Iron Curtain saying, "Don't fence me in." Remember, Winston Churchill referred to that dividing line between Eastern Europe and Western Europe as an Iron Curtain because the Soviet Union didn't want Western Europe, didn't want the West to know what was going on in Europe, and didn't want the people in Eastern Europe to see what was going on in Western Europe. Remember, after World War II, Western Europe, because of capitalism, is going to re-energize much more quickly than the countries of Eastern Europe. So let's take some time today and look at the events that took place from the 1950s and 1960s that signal that not everything's rosy behind the Iron Curtain. If you refer to that map, you see the orange countries are the Soviet Union and their satellite nations of East Germany, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria. And we can't forget about Yugoslavia and Albania. But remember, Yugoslavia and Albania, being communist, were not under the direct control of the Soviet Union like the other countries. However, the first signal that not everyone was happy with what was going on behind the Iron Curtain happened in East Germany in June of 1953. There are uprisings in East Germany. People not happy with the division of Germany. People not happy with the slow improvement in the economic conditions in East Germany. How did the Soviet Union respond to this? The Soviet Union sent in their military and put down the uprisings. Three years later, revolutions took place in Hungary. October 1956. Many people in Eastern Europe were led to believe from U.S. propaganda that they would have the support of the United States. And in 1956, there was a revolution in Hungary wanting democratic reform. However, just like in East Germany, the Soviet Union responded with their military. It was at this point when the people in Eastern Europe knew that help wasn't going to come from the United States. That the United States wasn't willing to risk a war with the Soviet Union over an area where communism had been established. Things are pretty quiet in Eastern Europe until the reform movement that took place in Prague. We would probably call it Prague, but in Czechoslovakia they would call it Prague. In August of 1968, reform movements were taking place. There were people that wanted to see changes in the government system, in the economic system. How were these reform movements met? Yep, you guessed it. The Soviet Union brought their military in and put them down. 3 uprisings, 3 cries for attention, 3 attempts to change the system in Eastern Europe. All 3 had been put down by the Soviet Union. Nine years later, in Czechoslovakia, Charter 77 was released by several citizens of Czechoslovakia. These citizens wanted to see reforms in Czechoslovakia. Now look at the past. Look at what's happened. Here in Czechoslovakia, the Czech government took care of it. You could probably understand. The Czech government had the belief, they had the idea, if they didn't put down this slowly developing movement, that the Soviet Union would come in. So the Charter 77 writers were punished. They were put in prison, lost their jobs, lost their licenses. Nothing's going to happen for 3 years. And then in August of 1980, there's a series of labor strikes taking place in Poland. Just that whole idea of labor strikes being allowed to take place. But there's widespread labor strikes, especially in the shipyards of Poland. And the Polish government sits down with the strikers and they come up with an agreement. This agreement is going to allow people of Poland greater civil rights. Things that you and I take for granted. For the first time ever, an independent trade union is going to be allowed in a communist country. This trade union isn't going to have to answer to the Communist Party. This is pretty dramatic, what happens in 1980. However, later the next year, the leader of Poland, he responds by introducing martial law. Why? Well, the idea is he was afraid that if he didn't try to put an end to these huge changes that were taking place in Poland, you guessed it, that the Soviet Union would come in. So in December 1981, martial law was enacted in Poland in an attempt to limit the power of the trade unions. Everything changes in March 1985. Mikhail Gorbachev becomes the 8th leader of the Soviet Union. Lenin and Stalin and the 5 leaders that follow all are from the same generation. They were from the generation that brought communism into the Soviet Union. Mikhail Gorbachev is second generation. But in March 1985, Mikhail Gorbachev becomes the leader of the Soviet Union. Understand, it's really important that you understand that he's the first Soviet leader from a new generation. And he's not afraid to admit he understands that the Soviet Union is struggling economically. The previous leaders knew the Soviet Union was struggling economically, but they were set in their ways. They didn't want to admit that maybe the system needed to be reformed a little bit. Mikhail Gorbachev was willing to implement what those previous leaders would call radical changes that had never been experienced in the Soviet Union. So finally today, let's look at these radical changes. Let's look at what Mikhail Gorbachev wanted to do when he came to power in 1985. Mikhail Gorbachev was a member of the Communist Party. He believed in communism. He wasn't someone that was like, oh, let's get rid of communism, let's get rid of communism. He was proud to be a communist. He grew up on a farm, went to college, became a lawyer, joined the Communist Party, worked his way up the system into what we call the Politburo, the group of people who were the leaders, and out of that Politburo comes the leader. And in 1985, Mikhail Gorbachev becomes the 8th leader of the Soviet Union, the first from the second generation. It's really important for you to understand that he believed in communism. Mikhail Gorbachev is still alive today, by the way. Here in the United States, we see him as a hero. Some people in the former Soviet Union see him as a failure because of what's going to take place. We'll look at that tomorrow. But again, Mikhail Gorbachev is a strong believer in communism. He just thinks it needs to be reformed. He thinks they've gone astray, that there needs to be changes within the system there in the Soviet Union. So Mikhail Gorbachev basically wants to do three things. One of the things he wants to do, he refers to as glasnost, openness. In the Soviet Union's past, if you were critical of the leadership, you could be jailed. You could be exiled. You could be sent to Siberia. You could be killed. Mikhail Gorbachev believed that was the wrong approach. Mikhail Gorbachev wanted people to discuss. He wanted people to sit down and talk about what the problems were that were facing the Soviet Union and possibly what could they do. So to the shock of many staunch, what we would call hardliners, he encourages open discussion within the country. He encourages people to talk about what possibly could be done. Another one of his philosophies, he termed perestroika, which in English means restructuring. He wanted to restructure the political system in the Soviet Union, and he wanted to restructure the economic system within the Soviet Union. We have to go back in the history of the Soviet Union, and when Lenin implemented the communist system, one of the first things the Communist Party did was outlaw all other political parties. Well, with the idea of glasnost, one of the things that Mikhail Gorbachev wanted to do when it came to restructuring the political system was to allow other political parties to exist besides the Communist Party. He thought that was good for the country. He thought that was good for the Communist Party. When it came to economics and restructuring the economic system, he thought it was important that the Soviet Union actually put some capitalistic ideas, start implementing some ideas of capitalism within the communist system. Now, some people looked at what Gorbachev was doing and said, this is a good thing. These things are good. But again, there were some people in the Soviet Union, we're going to refer to them as hardliners, that they're going to be in shock. They're going to be dismayed at what Gorbachev is doing. The third thing that Gorbachev wanted to do goes with what was happening with the United States, with Ronald Reagan, putting the Soviet Union into that arms race. Well, Gorbachev realized the Soviet Union couldn't keep doing that. Gorbachev realized the importance of not having an arms race with the United States. Gorbachev realized the amount of money that the Soviet Union was spending to have an arms race with the USA was really hurting the Soviet system. So he wanted to stop having an arms race with the United States. He wanted to meet with the President of the United States and somehow come up with some type of plan that could limit Russian or the Soviet spending on the military. Tomorrow, we'll look at what takes place in the Soviet Union from 1985 to 1991, when the Soviet Union ceases to exist. Until tomorrow, have a good day.